This session is not only the opening session for the Winter 2024 Soiree, but it's also going to be posted online in the SIGGRAPH Education Committee's continuing video series, In Good Company, where we try to bring in people from industry to talk about topics that are of interest to educators. Or as I like to say, they watch the video and they go, gee, I could do that too. And that's what we try to do. And today we have the pleasure of welcoming two wonderful people from SideFX Houdini. Nicole Campbell, who is the Education Account Manager at SideFX. Nicole has 10 or more years experience working with industry professionals to create top-notch training content for visual effects studios and schools. She says she's a native to Oklahoma. And aside from spending time with her friends and being outside in nature, Nicole said she enjoys doing anything with her 10-year-old daughter. And I can understand those days because we had a daughter too. We also have Peter Arcara, who is the training lead at SideFX. Peter creates courses for the Houdini Insight Learning Platform and consults with instructors about curriculum and supports the Houdini educator community. He also loves watching rocket launches and F1 races in his free time. Man, you guys packed it in. Okay, I'm going to be turning it over to Peter for their presentation. Peter, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. Really appreciate being invited here to present to the soiree today. And yeah, I'll start presenting here. Share my screen real quick. What we're going to be talking about today is we're going to kind of talk a little bit about how proceduralism can be used in not only in the in large scale education that's focused on visual effects and training very specifically in that industry, but also how it could just be used in education as a whole. So there's a couple goals that we're going to have for this presentation. So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what SideFX and Houdini is. Not all of you may know what that is or may be familiar with that. So we'll bring you up to speed a little bit on that. We'll learn about some VFX concepts that could enhance your curriculum. We'll talk a little bit about why it's beneficial for students to learn about effects and kind of how it doesn't matter what level we're doing this at. You'll hear me say quite a few times, the different levels that you could bring in for your students to be able to learn these different concepts. And then we'll talk a bit about how SideFX supports educators. Nicole will talk about some specific initiatives, and I'll talk a little bit about how we do that within the actual software. Throughout the presentation today, you'll see me talking about Houdini specifically, but these ideas of visual effects are true no matter what platform you're using. So while we're talking about this from the focus of Houdini, obviously there's other options out there in the industry, and these are just really kind of conversation starters to be able to understand a little bit about what just different ways that you could possibly implement visual effects in your curriculum. So let's start out by saying, what is SideFX? Like, well, who are we? What do we do? So we're a company based out of Toronto, Canada. We've been recognized as an industry leader for procedural software. We just won our 6th Oscar that was announced recently. Those folks there are some of the senior leadership on the team, and actually the guy with the goofiest face in that picture is our CEO, Kim. Yeah, we've been really fortunate to be seen by the Academy and by the Emmy committees as winners for our technical achievements. And so the gentleman on the left there, Jeff, just was awarded an Oscar for this year's upcoming event. So that's really excited, and we've been celebrating that recently. And just in general, we've been used in feature films for a lot, and I'll show a few examples of that, so kind of how we are used in that nature in the industry. But we also go far beyond just media and entertainment. There's a lot of other uses out there for Houdini, and so you'll see that relatively shortly here. I'll kind of talk through some different examples of how we're used across the industry. So what is Houdini? Houdini is a procedural software, which basically means that we create these recipes to be able to basically start with something at the top as kind of an input, and we'll create a recipe in this network and put nodes down to create different steps in that process. And then at the end, we'll get some sort of output generated. I'll have a really practical example of this in a second so you can see exactly what I'm talking about if you've never seen how Houdini works. But this idea of proceduralism is something that is really spreading across all DCC applications, whether you're talking about Maya or Blender or Unreal. All these softwares are really kind of diving into this proceduralism concept. And so we've been doing this for quite a long time. Houdini originally came out in 1996 and had this concept of proceduralism then. And so we've been doing this for quite a few years. And the company SideFX has been around for about 36 years now at this point. So we've been around for a little bit. And so let's talk a little bit about what exactly proceduralism is, because that might not be, something that you inherently just know kind of what it is. So we'll first talk about what non-procedural workflows are. And these are really destructive workflows. And the best way of kind of thinking of a non-procedural workflow is when maybe you're modeling something in a 3D application. It's almost like you're kind of carving away at a piece of wood, right? You're kind of making these edits to this geometry that exists in 3D, and you're saying, okay, I'm going to take away this part. I'm going to curve, bevel this edge. I'm going to extrude this thing or inset something. Whatever those edits are, usually they're locked in place. And yes, you can undo them and redo them, but it's sort of this linear workflow where you're kind of taking little pieces away as you go. And really, once you're done with that process and you hit save on your entire scene and maybe close it, those edits are kind of locked in. You can't go back. So that's the idea of non-procedural. These are kind of a destructive workflow. And we say that in the sense of not that it's a bad workflow, but just that that's how it goes. You can't really go back as easily. And there are things in Houdini that sometimes do present themselves as a little bit destructive. There are some ways in which that works, but we try to keep absolutely everything as best we can as a procedural workflow. And so what does that mean? So basically, like I said earlier, we're talking about these processes that are almost like a recipe. You take this thing, like in a recipe, you take this, whatever ingredient, you put it in an oven for a certain amount of time, you let it sit at this temperature, and you get a result at the end. You could also look at it sort of as a factory, right? You have an input that might be something like wood, and you want to turn that into a broomstick. Well, you're going to have to cut it, you're going to have to shape it to a certain size. Maybe you put it on a lathe and spin it up to a certain diameter. And you do all these processes, and in the end, you get maybe a wooden broomstick handle, something like that. Well, with a factory, obviously, you could go in and change parameters, right? You could change how that piece of wood is being lathed or the size you're cutting it at, and get a different output, maybe say a baseball bat or something like that. So in that case, you're taking in raw materials, doing a process on it, and then getting an output at the end. And that's really more what the procedural workflow is. These parameters and options are kind of live at all times, and you can go through and change those as you want. So let's take a look at kind of how that works in the actual interface, just so you can get a better sense of what it is that we're talking about here. So this is me working in Houdini, and this is going to be just a simple recipe that I'm going to make. So I'm going to place this geometry on the ground plane. We're going to select some random polygons, and then we're going to extrude them. So you can see I'm going through and selecting it. That little blue flag is moving. That just means the visualization is changing to that location. And what I'm going to do up at the top here is add a switch in there. You can see there's a green switch, and it's going to allow us to switch between these different geometries: a sphere, one of our test geometries, which is the rubber toy, and another one of our maybe weirder geometries, which is a pig head. And so this select is going to allow us to actually switch between that live. This is all this is all real time. There's no sped up nature to this. So as I change that input at the top, you're going to see this process done to the different geometries. So now it's placing all those different geometries on that ground plane. Next, it'll select the random polygons, and you can see as we switch them, those different geometries will have their random polygons selected. And then at the next step, we'll see those random polygons extruded. Now, this isn't a really practical example. This is a little bit contrived, but hopefully it shows the nature of which you can do these different random processes on different geometry and, be able to have these parameters live and editable. Obviously, we could go in and change the extrusion depth and all that kind of stuff. This is kind of the idea of how Houdini works. And really just in general, the idea of a procedural network, right? Using nodes that have live parameters that are able to switch kind of at will of the user. Now, some things might be quicker or slower to do and change in real time, but this is the idea of proceduralism. And so you might be saying, well, what can you do with Houdini? Like, what does it allow you to do? Well, there's quite a few things that Houdini is able to do. We've packed a lot into our software, but really just with proceduralism in general, you can do a lot of different things. With our software, we're really mainly known for effects and doing kind of explosions and crumbling things and water flooding into places and things like that. But you can also do animation and rigging. You can do lighting, look dev, rendering, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot you can do with Houdini. And hopefully this slide will just serve to maybe break down some of those misconceptions that were only there to blow things up and flood scenes with crazy, huge tidal waves and stuff like that. But a really important thing is to talk about where Houdini and proceduralism is used in the industry. And so film and TV is really a big place where we see those things used, right? That's kind of our bread and butter. That's where we're known for our work. But there's a lot of other things that can be done with it, right? One thing that's really popular is using our recipes as kind of assets in level design for video games and bringing in different little procedural networks as files into those systems. You can actually do this through a concept called Houdini digital assets. And so really any network can be wrapped up, brought into a game engine and used procedurally there with all those parameters promoted. So what you saw me doing there a few seconds ago can be all done in a game engine as well. So artists could develop different set pieces and things like that, or design levels, terrain generation, all that kind of stuff. So game design is a really big thing that we've been used for recently. Machine learning is another kind of big place that we're seeing use of Houdini. We're starting to get into some machine learning to accelerate processes in our software itself. We have also released, we've added in an Onyx inference engine recently into Houdini to allow for people to be able to do machine learning, processing right within Houdini. But also it's great for generating training data, maybe self-driving cars. You're generating hundreds of cities for these cars to drive through, process how they're seeing the world. That could be something that could be easily done in Houdini, especially with that procedural nature. Could be done in a lot of other softwares that include procedural generation as well. So these are things to think about when you're talking about procedural, the procedural nature of generation, right? Product design is another one where procedural workflows are really popular because it allows for that quick iteration that maybe somebody is looking to design a shoe, for example, and they want to see a bunch of different outputs of maybe some really organic growth on this shoe. I saw something recently where someone was doing bio electrical elements in their shoe design to like test how people are walking and to make sure that the shoes are conforming to their kinematics and things like that. So there's some really neat stuff that you could do in product design, and the procedural nature allows that iteration to happen really quickly. Medical visualization is another great place that proceduralism can be used, simulating tissue and allowing doctors and people in the medical field to be able to see processes happen inside the body and be able to simulate that without having to get into a real surgery situation. That's obviously a really huge benefit for them. Motion graphics is a huge place where Houdini is used and where proceduralism comes in really handy as well. That's actually my background is from the motion graphic world and the advertising world. And so having that quick iteration of proceduralism is just really, really helpful in that case. And then finally, this kind of field of AR and VR is something that kind of ebbs and flows and kind of finds its way into a lot of different things. Obviously, we all have smartphones in our pockets. There's ways to use AR in that sense. VR is again kind of coming and going all the time. There's different uses for that. Obviously, Apple has released their new thing, and so there's lots of different ways that proceduralism could be used there to process assets to go into these AR and VR scenes to be able to get them ready for that type of workflow. Maybe you're reducing polygons or changing things, whatever. There's a lot of different ways that can be used. So this hopefully gives you an idea for how some of these things are being used out in the industry. But to just give you a little sense of maybe to hear me talk a little less, well, I'll still be talking over these videos, but to give you something visual to look at, let's talk a little bit about some of the media and entertainment ways that Houdini's used and that effects and VFX are used, just to give you a sense of what we're going to be kind of looking at here. So these are a couple notable features that used Houdini. So this is from Frozen 2, and you can see a lot of fluid simulation here. These are obviously feature film level examples, but this is kind of the end result of what a lot of Houdini work is done out in the media and entertainment field. Here we're seeing fluid simulation, the idea of rigid body simulations, which we'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes here, and particle effects, magical effects. Obviously, character animation is being used here as well. But these are all things that are being done in Houdini procedurally and can be done procedurally in a number of different ways. So this is where this is really being used in the industry, and it gives art directors and directors on films and in all sorts of different creative fields ways to be able to kind of sit there and say, okay, let's tweak this and push this, and it allows the artist to then have a lot of options to be able to make changes as they go and kind of create the end look that a director or an art director might be looking for. So this is just an example of the waves. And this is kind of an interesting use of some procedural setups where they had the need for a fog curtain. And the way to do something like that is actually to simulate a big curtain, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. And using some tools, they in Houdini specifically here, they turned that curtain into a big kind of layer of dense fog that was able to be animated and simulated. And so this is kind of the process of using something like this, where you can go in, you can give parameters, you can set values, and then be able to tweak those as the director might say, oh, we need it to be draped a little differently here, or be a little heavier or thicker here. The procedural nature means those things are all live for the artist to tweak and manipulate. And so it's a pretty interesting result to see how they came across something like this and really just used what's actually, when you think about it, a very simple concept. They're just draping a big piece of cloth and then turning it into some fog with some tools, in this case in Houdini. So just an interesting example. And then another, just to kind of pull this in a little bit of a different direction to something a little bit more realistic, here's examples from The Lion King. So this is these are just showing a bunch of different ways that procedural visual effects are being used in these different shots. The hair simulations, fire simulations, there's water simulations and sand simulations that are all being shown here. And we're going to talk a little bit about a lot of these different effects in a minute, and talk about how we can implement these in education. Now, obviously, this again is at a feature film level. There's hundreds of artists working on these effects. These aren't the types of things that you're going to see every student be able to do in every different program, but I hope throughout this presentation you'll see that it doesn't have to be at this level, right? This is not what we expect students to all be coming out of out of universities, or maybe even out of secondary school, if we're starting to implement some of those some of these things in our higher education. These aren't the things that we expect students to come out doing, but it's just a cool example to show where these effects can kind of be pushed to their current limits and even beyond as we get into, obviously this is a few years old, and there's, tons more that's been happening in recent years using this type of technology. So hopefully that's just an interesting way to see how these things end up in industry and where these effects are being used. But let's talk a little bit now about how we could actually add visual effects to your curriculum. Maybe you're a school that has a VFX degree, and this is going to be a little bit, of review for you. But maybe you don't have VFX at all in your coursework, and maybe you might think, well, we don't have a degree program in visual effects, so why would we add anything visual effects to our curriculum? And I would just say that I think that even if you have one class, one module, or maybe just one course, if you have that amount of availability in your course load, you can add this in kind of at whatever level you would like to do it at. And I think it's really beneficial for students to be exposed to this, because there's so much of this type of work that's going on out in the industry, and it is a really in demand thing to be able to put on your resume and say, hey, I understand how this works. And you can say, obviously you'll be at different levels coming out of schools and things like that, but it's good to see this type of thing and be exposed to it in your education journey. So throughout all of this, I'm going to be showing different examples of levels at which you could you know, expand your curriculum to involve VFX. So the first thing I would kind of suggest if you're looking to add visual effects into your curriculum would be adding in something with particle effects. Particle effects are probably the simplest thing to bring into your curriculum that a student can kind of get into and understand at a really basic level. And the reason for that is that we're mainly just talking about points here. These particles are just points, and we're able to manipulate the properties of these simulations pretty easily. They deal with a lot of very understandable real world phenomena. So for example, I set up a couple quick scenes here. On the left is one that has kind of a very wide wind pattern that's kind of blowing the particles back and forth kind of in these big swaths. And on the right, you'll see a very chaotic wind pattern that's kind of blowing these particles all around. Now you'll probably look at this and say, wait a second, those are lines. I've just basically made trails out of the particles for a few frames so that we can easily see them, and that the hopefully the compression won't blow anything up too much here. But these two different examples took me minutes to set up. They're not complicated at all, and they really teach students a lot of really interesting things about velocity, how forces affect things. You could add gravity into these simulations. You can have colliders. There's all sorts of different ideas and concepts there where you bring in these physics-based topics into your lectures, into your labs, and allow students to play around with some of these really neat examples. And then if you wanted to take that a little bit further, you could do these really interesting effects with this. So this again is a bit more complicated to set up, but it was maybe 30 minutes of my time tops to set something like this up. And it really gives a really neat kind of working example of how you could do some of these really interesting magical, like disappearing effects on geometry really quite simply with different procedural processes. And this is all happening pretty live in the viewport. Now, this is maybe half speed what you would see as you're working, but all of these things I could say, okay, I want that noise that's kind of making this disappear to be more coarse or less coarse, and it will change the look of this simulation, but everything is linked together. So those particles are driven by how the geometry is being cut, and then the forces applied to those particles are set by different wind conditions and things like that. So these are really concepts that are very straightforward for students to understand. These are things that don't take a lot of extra explaining to explain how wind works or how velocity, the concept of velocity or bounce, from collisions, things like that. It's all very intuitive and easy to explain, and you can start to get them interested in some of these concepts pretty quickly. So that's one idea, and that's kind of always where I suggest for people to start, is with something like particles. But then when you start to, want to get into something a little bit more interesting, we start to talk about something like rigid body destruction. And what this really means is anything that isn't going to be deforming when it collides. And often it involves fracturing and breaking and crumbling. Think of a skyscraper crumbling. Think of, anything, when you have an explosion or whatever, there's big chunks that go flying. That's a lot of the rigid body destruction that we're going to be talking about here. I'll be calling it RBD just because it's a little shorter to say. And so you'll probably hear me say that a few times, but that's what I'm kind of meaning here. So here's a really simple example. If you were looking to put this in just as like a quick, I have a day, one lecture to bring in, you could talk about something like this. This again is a very simple setup that I made myself in minutes. And it basically is a way that you can set up fracturing and glue these pieces together. So again, you're talking about very simple ideas here. You're talking about, how do I want this to fracture? What's the glue strength that I want to set up, and how do those kind of shocks propagate through this and break that material up as we go? We can also one thing that we have in a lot of our tools in Houdini, and I'm sure is true in across the industry, is there's presets for our different materials. So this is a concrete material, but if we wanted this block to fracture like wood or to fracture like glass, there's ways of doing that as well. And we'll see that in this next kind of more bespoke example. So this is a very simple example. We're just basically taking a box, fracturing it. I added some colors just so you could see what was happening a little bit easier there. But again, like I said, this is a very simple example and a way that you could introduce some of these concepts to your students. And then when you wanted to, if you wanted to get into something quite a bit more, higher, and you could get into something like this where we're using those different presets that I talked about, the wood, glass, and kind of concrete, and adding in forces, right? We're adding velocities in, we're adding in, obviously there's collisions happening between the geometry, and we have different kind of bounce parameters that we've set up. So these different elements will interact with each other in different ways and shatter in different ways. And really, we're able to do quite a bit to make sure that these are being glued together properly and that we're constraining these things as they happen. So this looks probably very daunting. Like, how could you ever teach a student how to do this? But really, there's presets that we have set up and ways that you can very simply go through step by step and make something like this. So, this obviously isn't for a one lecture example, but if you had a module maybe to do, maybe you would work up to this for something in rigid bodies. This is an example that would maybe take a day to set up. Modeling would be a different step, and you could actually get a model from any other program as well. It doesn't have to be made in Houdini. You could bring in models from any number of the content creation applications out there. So that's another thing that I want to make very clear, is that I'm not saying that this all has to be done in Houdini. You can bring things in very easily, and we play well with other softwares and in across the industry. So let's keep talking a little bit more about effects. And one next kind of step that I would say would be talking about something like fluid simulations. And in this sense, we have some really interesting presets that we have for instructors to be able to look at and for learners to be able to look at. These are all presets that come with Houdini. So up in the top left, you'll see one of our test geometries that you actually saw earlier getting melted into kind of a little puddle with varying viscosity. Again, we're talking about physics concepts that are able to be taught to students through this, where we're varying the viscosity through that liquid, through those particles, and his head is much more viscous than his body and therefore stays as is. In the middle, we're dealing with a kind of lava simulation where as it cools down, it becomes more viscous and kind of hardens. Again, very intuitive examples there. And in the top right, we have a kind of a wave example that's showing different waves crashing and breaking. It's a very low resolution simulation, which means that the particles are very big and don't, you can obviously bring them to a smaller scale, but it gives you an idea of how these things work. And the reason that we really ship these examples is that when you ask for these presets in our node network that you saw earlier, you actually get a node setup that gets dropped down into your scene. And you can go through and play around with those different presets. So you can go through and change the viscosity, change the way that those things are kind of falling off through that rubber toy asset, or change the temperature that lava is being emitted in the middle, or the wave strength. You can change all of these things, and it really is simply going in and changing a few parameters to be able to see the results of that. And it gives educators an easy way to instruct students, and it gives learners a really great way to see how these things are done, even that might be a little bit more complex than what they're exactly ready for. It gives them a sense to kind of look into those things. And so that's something that hopefully you'll hear a lot throughout this presentation, is that you don't have to be making Pixar level work. You can get in and start playing around with some of these ideas and teaching students even just the bare basics to get them introduced into what these effects look like. And it's something that as educators, we don't have to be really afraid of either. It's much more accessible today than it ever has been to be able to get into some of these things and teach them to your students. And obviously, just as an example, you can get into really intense, crazy scenes and be able to really take all these things and bring them together, where you're bringing in wave effects and splashes and white water. All of these things are supported in Houdini, but across the industry, there's tons of really great tools and ways of working with this. And, you can kind of go as big or as small as you want on these different setups. So maybe you do have a branch of your degree that specializes in visual effects. Maybe you want to bring in fluids and things like this. You can take those things as far as you want to, especially in Houdini and in many applications across the board. And you'll hear me talk a little bit later about our content library. A lot of these larger scenes or pieces of these larger scenes are actually available in that content library for educators to take a look at and break down and see exactly how they were made, so that you can start your students along a journey that will get them to those places. So we try to provide as much as we can, and we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later. Another thing that obviously we're known for at SideFX and in Houdini is fire, right? Making explosions and things like that. So all these things that you're seeing here on the screen are all presets again in Houdini. You literally type configure fireball, and you will get one of these fireballs. Configure billowy smoke, you'll get the billowy smoke in the middle. There's a lot of, we try to give these presets out so that it can be seen how these processes are done in Houdini. And so that makes it a lot less opaque how maybe these big studios do these crazy effects, and gives you a sense, again, this is a node network that will make this fireball or make this object burning or this ground explosion, whatever it might be. You can even see there's muzzle flashes that we support there. And you can see some of those little sparks flying off that should look pretty similar to how I made those particle effects, because really that's all that is just some particle effects coming off the end of that. So these different processes can be mixed and matched as well. And since it's procedural, as you change velocities and change the input parameters to these simulations, the output will change in ways that you can hopefully predict and expect how they will happen. So some really neat presets that we like to give out for learners and for instructors as well, to be able to kind of get into these different concepts. And then you take these concepts and layer them on top of each other, you can create something really incredible like this. Now, this is a huge simulation, right? There's a lot going on here, but really the way to look at things like this is that they're pieces, right? Each of these individual elements are pieces of that greater whole. And so that explosion in the middle, that's one simulation. Those rings coming out, that's just simply animated little particle rings that come out and source some velocity into that scene. The billowy smoke that's coming up from the ground or around the bottom there, and that kind of more diffuse smoke at the bottom, those are just animation driven, and kind of we source some velocities into our simulation, and that's probably its own simulation as well. So these look like super daunting examples, but really you can break them down into smaller pieces and talk about that with students and be able to kind of say, this is how you would get to this result. Granted, you're not going to be able to do a lecture on a gigantic fireball like this in one course, or maybe even in a week, but you can go through and start to break these things down and help guide students to how they can start to explore some of these larger concepts in visual effects. So hopefully that gives you a nice little overview of some of the different effects, topics that you could maybe cover. And next I want to talk a little bit about character, animation, all sorts of different ways that we can work with character effects. A lot of schools have introduced character animation, and we have a kind of a focus right now on getting deeper into character animation and talking a little bit more about that and being more active in that space. So the first thing I'll say is that Houdini has character animation. It's not something that we're mainly known for, but we're really trying to make our tools as best we can. This is working in Houdini. However, this is very indicative of how rigging and animation works in a lot of different software packages. So this isn't anything new or novel that you're seeing specifically right here, but just gives you a sense for how character animation is done. So maybe you have a character animation, path in your curriculum. Maybe you don't. You could use Houdini as part of that. You could be using other software to help with that. But like I said earlier, in Houdini's sense, we like to play as best we can with all other software packages. So if you have animation coming in, that's totally fine. If you're doing that in Maya, doing that in Blender, wherever that may be, we're very happy to ingest that and be able to do some interesting things with those. But we just kind of want to say that character is certainly a huge part of the industry, right? Character animation is huge. And you can see how much work goes into something like just a simple pose like that on this chicken character, which actually is in our content library and you can play around with, which is really fun. And it's all rigged up and ready to go. So you could download this and start playing around with animation right in Houdini within a pretty short time frame and with very little overhead to get going. So your students could go in and play around with this little chicken. There's also a luchador that was with this is all part of our recent release of our software. So this is kind of the idea of character animation, and I highly recommend, if you haven't thought about including character animation in your in your curriculum, that it's something that's really very important in the industry. But there's other things too that you can do, especially within the world of effects, and that's really called CFX, or character effects. And that's something that Houdini's been doing for quite a while now, being used in the industry. You saw earlier with the Lion King examples. Somebody in the chat's just saying that their baby boy likes the chicken. That's great. Everybody thinks the chicken's pretty funny. So, but character effects is something that we've been known for several years now, with different tools and different tool sets that we've released. And this can exist in many different forms. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just something that I set up myself. I'm not a CFX artist. I'm not anybody that does this, has done this on like a deep professional level. But I was able to take some of our test geometry, the capybara here, that has a walk cycle, and add a little cape to him. He's a superhero now. And I was able to create different properties to that cloth to be able to make it certain level of bounciness and stretchiness and stiffness. These are properties that we set up in our simulations. I also made sure that it was constrained to his geometry there, right at his shoulders. And you see a little bit at the beginning, there's a little pre-roll. That's kind of a common thing in the industry, where you take this T-pose of your character, where maybe all the cloth is made to that shape, and then you move him into his kind of beginning frame for his animation, and that allows the cloth to kind of relax into that initial pose. So I did like about a 1 second little pre-roll here to make sure that it all worked properly. But anyways, this is a really simple thing that you could do. I did this in maybe, again, an hour worth of work, and yeah, everything was something really simple to set up here. And then we could talk about something even more more complicated here, like a cloth setup. Obviously, we can go in really deep and do tons of different parameters here and constraints to be able to control these different cloth simulations, and hair as well. This is another thing that we saw earlier. This is very similar to the lion you saw in the Lion King. That was all obviously done in Houdini. And we set up these guide hairs to be able to control how this simulation is kind of constrained. And then we add things like wind and things like that to be able to kind of control how this simulation is done. And one other thing that we kind of deal with in the character world, and we have some good tools for, and is something that should be considered, is dealing with mocap, right? It's a great way to bring in kind of pre-baked animations that your students can work with. Maybe they're not character animators. So in the green skeletons you're seeing there are the input motion capture data. That's from Mixamo in this case. And we're just retargeting it to different characters. So you could make it on a giant character or a robot or whatever. You can have these ways to basically take one set of animation and target it onto another character. So this is a really powerful thing to think about in your curriculum. Like, showing something like this would be a way to be able to introduce students to character animation in some sort of more tangible way. And then even more interestingly, you could take something like motion capture data, add a little bit of simulation, and then blend that back into something like keyframe animation. So in this case, the blue is all just motion capture and simulation, and then we transition into a green keyframe animated character. So that is kind of an idea of how you could kind of push these different concepts further and further. So I'll wrap my section up here with just saying, what do we provide? So one thing we provide within our software is test geometry. So you've seen some of these things in the presentation already, but these are just ways to kind of give students starting points. And we like to give some models in our software itself, so that we can have starting points to kind of play around with different effects, because obviously, like we showed, as you change the input, the effect can change. So it's good to have different models and different types of geometry to play with. So this is something we give, it's just out there. You can type in test and you'll get a bunch of different test geometry. But then maybe even more importantly, we have our content library. And these are all different examples that are scenes and models and examples that are usually released in conjunction with new releases of Houdini. And for that, we have all sorts of different things that we put out. You can see different rigs. You can see the luchador and the chicken there. There's some examples of renders, simulations, feathers, clouds, all sorts of different things that come out with each each new release. And we give the actual project files out there so people can look at them and break down maybe these really extreme examples of production, like that eagle feather scene is like a production level character that's groomed with feathers and all this really intense stuff that me as someone that isn't a character artist would have a hard time setting up from scratch. But once you can dive in and look at that, it gives you a really great place to understand how these professionals work and make these effects. So we like to give out these kind of tests, these scenes as a way for people to be able to get a sense of what can we do with Houdini or with, in VFX. There's tons of different things out there that are similar to this as well. So this is something that we do at SideFX to help people learn better, and hopefully it's something that will really benefit you if you look to get VFX into your curriculum. But that's going to be it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Nicole, and she's going to talk about some other ways that we actually support educators in maybe a bit more tangible, kind of behind the scenes ways. So I'll hand this over to Nicole. I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Peter. Can you guys see my screen? Awesome. Well, hello, my name is Nicole Campbell, and I am the Education Account Manager here at SideFX. Today, I wanted just to talk to you about what we offer schools and instructors on the education team. A big part of my role here on the education team is supporting our instructor community throughout each year, providing learning resources, assisting in coordination of presentations for students and faculty, among several other community offerings that we offer for schools and instructors. One of the first things that we offer each year, we offer free instructor's licenses for instructors to evaluate Houdini for teaching purposes. These are free Houdini education licenses, and they include almost all of the capabilities of our full commercial licenses. Also, a newer initiative that we have on our team in the last year is reaching the younger learner community in secondary schools. For secondary schools, we offer free education licenses for students and instructors. Our main goal here is exposure to Houdini for younger learners to really just alleviate that Houdini can be hard or it's hard to learn. I think exposing them at a younger age just kind of alleviates that fear. Students can also purchase their own license directly from SideFX.com for less than a subscription of Netflix. So they're $75 a year for a student license. And again, they can purchase those directly on SideFX.com. Another big offering for instructors outside of just the free instructor's licenses is access to Houdini Insight. This is our learning platform for instructors. If you think train the trainer, this is what comes in here. Our instructors can find demo videos, example files, and curriculum handouts for students. Many of the authors for these courses are our in-house training leads who are available for curriculum consultation as well as presentation. We also have a Slack community for instructors. This is just a safe space for instructors to network with other instructors, ask safe questions, and get answers from our Houdini experts as well. Bi-weekly, we host semi-weekly office hours. This is where we have a short presentation where you can see different ways Houdini is used in different projects from different schools or different people in the industry. And again, it's just another safe space for instructors to ask questions directly to our Houdini experts or other instructors in the community. Again, our main goal on the education team is to support our instructor community with resources and just help remove any roadblocks that might come up throughout the year. And again, these are the offerings that we have to support instructors in schools. I believe this will be shared out afterwards, but here in this link, you can find some additional resources for Houdini Insight, some information about our education team here at SideFX, as well as the foundations material that's offered on our website that you can download and distribute to your students as well. If you scan that QR code, that will take you directly to our Houdini education page. And again, if you have any questions, you feel free to reach out to us at education@sidefx.com. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Peter, Nicole, thank you very, very much. That was an excellent presentation. I'm just want to tell you that as you began to talk, Peter, I started writing down questions as the things I want to ask. But
Okay.
as the presentation was going through, I'm going answered, 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 and I'm like, yes, this is what I wanted to hear.
Cool.
So let's open it up to questions. Question and answer. Hopefully Nick is there because I'm not sure how he has this set up for the answers and questions.
Yeah, I mean, folks are welcome to use the Q&A to type in a question. We have William Barres is here. He's a education committee member who'll be chairing the next session, and so I figured I'll leave him on in case, I mean, if he wants to ask a question. But you know, one thing that
I was going to ask Nicole to lose her share, but I was thinking maybe not, because she may want to pop something up on her screen, answer to a question. So
yeah, actually, Nicole, I was going to ask if you didn't mind, if you could copy paste that Google Drive link into the chat, and that way folks attending.
Well, I'm going to tell you, put it in the chat, but also when this comes out as an In Good Company video, all the links which we were given by SideFX, by you guys, they're going to show up at the end of the video. So it's going to have a permanent record that people can find it right away. So
I'm trying to figure out where my screen is.
I just want to tell you, I am utterly impressed by the wealth of materials you supply faculty for helping them to teach the material. I mean, this is impressive. And Peter, one of the things you started by saying, one of the first things teach is particle systems. And I'm like, yes, because no, I'm serious, because I'll give you a really quick example. A couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of working with a middle school student who at their school, is a private school, they had to do an end of the year final project, and she wanted to do special effects. So I said, okay, let's not look at all special effects. Let's just try an explosion, and we're going to model the explosion using particle systems. And this is a middle school student, and if you present it correctly, they get it. It's really not as hard. Yeah, the level of detail you add to it can make it more complex, but as a concept, it is fairly simple, you know?
Yeah, we've had several different situations where we've been starting, like Nicole said, we've been starting to talk to secondary schools, and that's usually what we suggest to them. And we've had some really great examples of what they've been able to do in those different, with those different effects. And you can kind of take that and make it your own. It doesn't have to all look exactly the same. You can do so many different variations with just particles that it's really incredible the level at which the detail you can get with just that. So yeah, it's a really great starting point for students. And again, it's an easy thing to teach. It's very simple and intuitive kind of controls that those things use.
So
go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, we're just a couple minutes left, and we do have a question from a webinar attendee. So I think if I'll share that question with you guys, and we can kind of wrap up on that, and there'll be follow up online afterwards. But the question is asking about VR and AR device integration. And so I put it out to you guys. I know that there are Houdini engine tools that integrate what you can build as something in Houdini. You can build out like the nuclear explosion and RDVs and all that, and bring that into engines like Unreal Engine and Unity, and let those be the platforms that then convey what's built in Unreal into VR AR. Is there any other means for that?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say I'm just going to copy this link over here to the chat just so we have it. That's the Google Drive link for all of our resources. But so if you're looking to have any integration with game engines and things like that, that's obviously what a lot of the like VR and AR stuff is going to be, Unity, Unreal, things like that. We have an entire division of our company that does things called it's called Labs, SideFX Labs. And they deal with all of that type of stuff where we're taking data from a visual effects, say an explosion or particle system or destruction, whatever it might be, and putting that data in a way that these engines can really deal with in, you know, in a more efficient manner. So maybe in some cases that might be creating a sprite sheet of explosion images that are rendered simply just out of our viewport at a really high fidelity and brought over into the game engine as a way to you know, show these explosions or show a cloud or whatever it might be. That's one way that we do that. There's another thing where we do a lot of things with these vertex animation textures, which basically turns the point positions of one of those rigid body simulations into an image texture that then gets loaded on the graphics card and is able to be processed really fast by these different engines. And there's a lot of different ways that can be done. It is a deep subject to bring that data over because there's a lot of optimizations that need to happen in order to get game engines to play nicely with these sometimes complex visual effects and things like that. But certainly if you want more information on that type of stuff, our SideFX Labs team has an ArtStation page with lots of great tutorials and examples, and take a look at that. There's tons of great examples there for getting our stuff into engine or into a game engine. And also, if you're interested in geometry coming over, that would just be simply using a thing called Houdini engine. And that plugs right in as a plugin, and you bring these Houdini digital assets in there, and the interface comes right up from, you know, that like what you would see in Houdini shows up over in the game engine. It's really nice to be able to play around with those parameters live in an engine. So there's a few different ways that those things can be done.
Awesome. Thank
Nick,
you.
Nick,
Bill, do you have any final words before we
yeah, I do, because I just have a few questions just to wrap things up. Nicole, you mentioned about pricing for individual instructors and individual students. Do you have a site licensing process, pricing? Like a school wants to have it loaded on all the computers in X number of labs. Do you have pricing for that for schools?
Each license is going to be $75 per year. Each education license come with a full education license, Houdini engine, as well as the rendering.
So it's per license per workstation.
Yeah.
They're floating too.
They
as
are
well.
floating licenses. Yes.
Okay.
So.
This is the question, I guess, for Peter. I guess. Does it allow to deal with somebody who deals with programming? Do you have capability for scripting and plugins?
Yes, we have really extensive scripting ability. Pretty much anything that you can do with nodes in Houdini, you can also do with scripting, whether it's Python. You can get into C++ programming for creating your own tools. We have, like I said, we have Python API that deals with the viewport with all sorts of different, elements of our interface. You can even do geometry manipulation in Python. And we also have our own programming language that is like a C-like language that's called Vex. And that is super fast at dealing with like millions of points and polygons. I didn't know programming before I learned Houdini, and I was able to learn all of that stuff. So it's a great platform for that as well, for computer science kind of concepts.
Okay, one last question, try to wrap things up here.
Sure.
You talk about trying to teach students how to learn particle systems, right? Do you have any recommendations for books or other published resources that faculty could use? If you don't know it, you can say, I don't. But
yeah, I don't have any specific books or anything like that. But if you're looking for resources on training, well, first of all, we have.
Well, I'm talking about like understanding what is a particle system other than how to do it in Houdini.
I don't have a book that I can think of off the top of my head or any type of resource like that, but anything that would be generally a concept of a particle system could certainly be implemented in Houdini as well.
Excellent.
So
anyway, as host for this session, again, I want to thank Nicole and Peter for an absolutely fabulous presentation.
Thanks.
And I'm hoping that maybe you will be part of Educators Day, maybe for this year's conference, because this would be fabulous, and I'm sure you will be talked to. Okay, awesome. Nick, back to you.
Wonderful.
All right, thanks everybody. So I will, say goodbye to our friends from SideFX. Bill, you're going to be back in a few hours at the wrap-up session to tell us more about SIGGRAPH 2024.
Talking about the conference. Yes.
Yep, at 5 o'clock Eastern. So we'll take a 3 to 5 minute break here, and William Barras will be hosting our European contingent of presenters in just a few minutes. In the meantime, get yourself a beverage and a break, and we'll be starting in just a few more minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.